Welcome back to WordCamp Santa Clarita 2021. This is a 10 a.m. session with Craig West at the Colossus track. My name is Nico. I'm one of the organizers of the Long Beach chapter of the Los Angeles WordPress meetup, which is not too far from Santa Clarita, at least compared to our next speaker. Feel free to add your questions to the YouTube chat feed. We'll collect those and answer those at the end. We'll have a QA session. Craig is a freelance trainer and architect from Brighton who focuses on bringing together the WordPress and non-WordPress world by advocating WP HTML. He says, where there's HTML, there is WordPress. His session is WP REST API and web components, 100% internet.
Hello, Santa Clarita. I do hope you're enjoying the conference, and thank you to everyone who's made it a success and an enjoyment, to the volunteers and organizers and participants. I'm very pleased and privileged to be presenting this talk on the WordPress REST API and web components, giving us 100% internet. There is a site here that's available that has the links for the examples and slides, as well as a free coupon to an online course going through the WordPress REST API for Ajax pages and forms. I'll be available at the end of the talk if you have any questions, but always feel free to email me with any questions regarding this matter. Once again, we can have a quick look at the site. Here it is, with all the links. Here is the URL address. We'll proceed on now with the talk, and I do hope you enjoy. Thank you very much. Before we start, I'd just like us to ponder some questions. What is a WordPress site? Is your site content of value to others? Would increased exposure of your site be a benefit to you and your clients? And would a combination of your content and or interactivity with other sites be of value to you and your clients as well as that other site? And the reason I asked the first question, what is a WordPress site, is I'm going to show you a WordPress site now in a form you may not have seen before. I have a folder on my desktop. If I open it up, I see I have some basic HTML pages. I'm going to click on this one, Ajax HTML. I'm also going to open the DevTools F12 and sort of look at the console. And if I load posts, we can see that we are going to this particular WordPress site displaying some posts, and we can see the output here. I can go to another site. I can also load in some MySQL tables, or I can also load in some advanced custom fields, each covering from a different domain and a different WordPress site. And this is all running on my desktop in an HTML file. This is all made possible through the use of the REST API. And we can see, for example, we're getting back our 10 posts here, all the different values here. And we can see that when we go to this particular URL, we will be able to actually get that JSON data. And we're going to look at JSON data a little bit later, particularly as it takes place in the full site editing configurations. And if I click on that sort of file and open it up, if I come back and go into console and right click and open a new tab, we will see we'll get this JSON data coming back of all our posts. So the agenda for today's talk is to have a quick look at the state of the non-WordPress world, look at a demo conference booking app to give us a real-world context of how all these different apps, including WordPress, may work together. We will look at piece one, which is HTML5 and the generation of custom HTML, and piece two, which is the WordPress REST API itself. And then we're going to have a look at some demos of WordPress HTML blocks, both in WordPress, Gutenberg blocks, as well as in applications outside of WordPress. And we'll also look at and consider possible business and marketing uses. So the non-WordPress world today was nicely summed up at the keynote talk at the International JavaScript Conference in London in 2018, where the speaker spoke about Angular, React, Vue, etc., all the different frameworks peacefully united thanks to what he called web components or micro apps. And as we see in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that a web component is literally an HTML tag, and it has a script file, JavaScript file, so that it can perform its function. And a custom HTML tag, as we'll see, can be anything provided it has at least one hyphen to tell the browser it's custom and not to clash with any future HTML5 tags. So what is a custom HTML tag or a web component? It is our regular HTML tag that we can build ourselves. It must contain at least one hyphen so that it is distinguished as a custom HTML tag rather than a built-in browser one, and also so not to conflict with any future HTML5 tags that are created. We have a source file where we have our code, and what we must remember is that they are HTML tags and act just like HTML tags. The fact that we've made them ourselves doesn't make any difference. It's still a regular HTML tag. And we can see, for example, as we'll see later, the HTML anchor tag, that extends the HTML element class, which is what we actually use to make these custom components. And we'll go into that in more detail. So in a nutshell, a web component is an HTML tag that HTML5 allows us to create and inject HTML, CSS, JavaScript, effectively a complete app in a tag. And this is common in JavaScript frameworks, where they create an app and inject it into a root element on the page, for example, into a div element with a particular ID. In our system with web components, we use a custom tag that we've defined in any way that we wish, so long as it has a hyphen. So what if we, with our HTML blocks, could run anywhere where there is HTML and not be reliant on the framework or stack? What would we be able to do? And in this workshop or talk, there's no need to try and understand the code or the technology. That can be done afterwards. It is better today just to mull over the possibilities of what WordPress HTML blocks might bring to you and your business, rather than trying to understand in this short time how the code works. There are plenty of resources available on the site with this talk to explain that for you. So the agenda for today is just to have a quick look at the state of the non-WordPress world, to look at a demo conference booking app to give a sort of real-world context of what these blocks can do, to look at the two pieces that are involved in our HTML blocks, which is HTML5 and custom HTML, and the second piece being the REST API. And then we're going to look at some demos of WordPress HTML5 blocks in WordPress and other apps, and then consider what potential business or marketing uses may these HTML blocks give us. If we look at the non-WordPress world today, it was nicely summed up at the keynote talk at the International JavaScript Conference in London in 2018, where the talk was about JS frameworks all working together peacefully through the use of web components or micro apps. And before we get onto the subject of web components, a web component is just a custom HTML tag that we're allowed to define in the browser with an attached JavaScript file that can contain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, obviously, to create a whole app that's injected into a tag. As a result, what would normally be something like this with web components becomes a place where JS frameworks can all interact with each other by supplying web components to one another or to work together in an HTML page. And we're going to have a look at a little dummy conference app to show what this might look at. But it's worth noting that at the moment, WordPress does not seem to be involved, despite having, for example, in our conference app, travel guide information on hotels, restaurants, etc. So we'll now look at that conference app just to get an idea of how these web components work together. This is an idea of the sort of app we'll be using as context, that when we go to particular conferences, we can select all the different type of conferences in, say, a view app. When we click on one, it can get booked, gives information about flights. And what is happening is these are just web components, as we can see here, custom HTML tags that all interact with each other through various different means. And in this case, we're just using this by using events that get passed between component. So when we click, we can see that we're getting different messages being sent and listened to. So what we'd like to do is go from here to here, where WordPress has its own web components that can be used also in Gutenberg blocks and pages, but can now interact with this whole conference apps in the following way. We now put in our own WordPress web component here, so that when we come back to our app and refresh it, we can see straight away that when we click on, so we say a town, Paris, a city, Paris, we can now get information about Paris or Tokyo or Oslo, and we see that down here. So what we've now done is been enabled to WordPress to work as one of these web components in an app with other JS frameworks, responding to events as programmed. Web components in WordPress are not a new topic. Here we see at the WordCamp Europe 2019, Felix talking about the power of custom elements in Gutenberg. We also see Felipe talking about web components used in WordPress, as well as by Rob at the Omaha WordCamp in 2019 about building blocks in Gutenberg using web components. So with that in mind, we can see now. So to create our WordPress HTML blocks, there are two pieces. The first being the block, the web component that comprises both UI and obviously application code. And the second being the WordPress REST API, where we can get and post data. Firstly, we're going to look at the web component side. And what we will see is that it's actually a standard in HTML5. And as we see from this definition here, HTML5 is not just a set of behaviors and elements, but also a set of new technologies that allow us to build more diverse and powerful websites and applications, and very nicely called HTML5 and Friends. And what this means is that we can actually create our own HTML tags. But let's just have a quick look at, for example, an anchor tag, which we're all familiar using in our code. And what we can see is that the anchor tag just inherits the HTML element class. And an anchor tag is really a web component. It has props or attributes, the reference it's going to, at the target, whether same window or new window, has an event handler, the click event. And if we also proceed further with, shall we say, an input element, we can see the great range of properties that we get on an input element and the code that must be involved inside to ensure that we get the right validation message based on these attributes. So if we look at a custom HTML tag, we can see that we can define it in any way we want. It must have a hyphen, at least one hyphen, to tell the browser that it's a custom tag, and also that it doesn't clash with any future types of HTML tags that are built into the browser. And once again, we can see that we actually extend the HTML element class. Now we're going to have a little look at some code. Don't try to understand it. It's not important. It's just to give an overview of the size of the code and what we actually use. And if we go in, we can look that it's extending the HTML element. We're calling our class showPost, and we're defining our own custom element show-post, which we can see down here. And for example, here we're setting an attribute of post ID. The only thing that I'd like to draw attention to here is web components have these properties of observing attributes and firing a function when they change, which when we see an example will show us that actually these re-render whenever we change one of these elements. It's a sort of built-in reactivity. So we'll now have a quick look at our own example of a web component. And if we go to the code, what we can see here is that I've created a showPost web component with an ID for a post of 4. So when we look at the page here, we can see that we're getting this particular post. And if we draw our attention to here in the DevTools, look here when I actually change the attribute to a different post. Notice how it changed here and automatically re-rendered. And I can go back here and literally change it here, type it in, and it will change. And this is one great feature of web components, that the ability to re-render themselves when an attribute is changed if it is wired in that way. So we've seen our first example of a WordPress HTML block, a simple post that can be programmatically changed and rendered. But obviously a post could be a product, could be a whole article, could be an app. So straight away we're looking that a simple web component, for example here, can be used to host a lot of different WordPress data and functionality. We'll be seeing more examples of WordPress HTML blocks, but let's ask who uses web components. Well, web components is used greatly by Google. They have over 20,000. They're used also in Google Accelerated Mobile Pages. The whole Ionic framework, that is one JavaScript, HTML, CSS code base used in any app, iOS, Android, web or desktop. And Salesforce itself has developed what they call their Lightning web components that build on the raw HTML APIs, so that when they buy new companies, they can all work towards a common framework. And as we know, Salesforce has been purchased by Slack. So we can see web components are very active. They make up perhaps 5% of the web. And it is worth reminding ourselves that it is HTML5. It's not a framework outside of HTML5. It's all browser compliant. It's part of the browser and can be used on any platform that supports HTML5. We now look at the second piece of a WordPress HTML block, and that's the REST API, because we need to be able to get and post data to our database. And if we look at WordPress, we have our MySQL database, and normally we run our PHP code that produces a web page. But we can also use PHP to create this JSON data. JSON data is JavaScript object notation. It's a way of sending data across the web, and it's essentially key value pairs. And we can see that here. And it could be like an array of arrays. And we can see, for example, here, the hello world of the REST API is where we get wp/v2/posts, which gives us the last 10 posts. But we can select just the fields that we want, because we do get by default far more information. We can also get data from our MySQL tables, our own custom data tables, and we can also post and get JSON data from WordPress. And if we have a look at a few more examples, we can see here when I talked about the last 10 posts, we get a whole range of information which we can filter down as we wish. Now there's a lot to the REST API, and I have a free online course at Udemy where you can learn more about the REST API, what it is, how to amend it, how to create your own, how to post data in forms in WordPress. The link is on the site and the link is here. The coupon is valid for a couple of days, 48 hours. Please make use of it. It is totally free and is a comprehensive guide for using the REST API for headless or for pages that don't need refreshing in WordPress. So that concludes the second piece of HTML blocks. And what we will do now is we'll move on to some demos of seeing different types of blocks and their functionality and how they can be used in WordPress, but also outside of WordPress as HTML blocks or plugins. Before going on to look how we can use these blocks outside of WordPress, we're going to look at how these blocks can be used in WordPress. And we have a site here where I'm going to demonstrate a web component in basically a WordPress page and also in Gutenberg blocks using the example from Felix Arndt that we saw previously in this presentation. And so if we go to the page that we're going to be using, it's a custom page in WordPress, and we can see here that very same web component. The script file is put in here for demo purposes, but it would be included in a regular production. And so now if we actually come to this page, we can see it here. Let's quickly just do a quick refresh. We see that post ID, we can change it, and there it is. So this is an example of how we can just use all these tags, because remember they're plain HTML tags, even though they're custom, with a JavaScript file. So it's a great way to encapsulate some code samples and code modules. Now if we log in behind the scenes, we can see how we can use one of these as a component. So if we go into posts and we'll click on add new, if we come down here, we can see as we come down here, there is a block called latest post. It's the one in the demo repo that's available here in these. If we click on that in here, we can see there's references to all these examples that have been used by other people in WordCamps. And we can see just now how we can actually put in that particular latest post web component, which will be displayed in Gutenberg blocks. So we've seen now examples of how we can use that code in WordPress pages and in Gutenberg blocks. And we'll move on to examples of WordPress HTML blocks outside of the WordPress stack. One more time, we'll have a look at the conference app as our first demonstration. And if you remember that we had our three different components, something finding the events, booking the events and flights. And we could also list out a WordPress component that would basically react to the very same event signals that were passed to each of these apps and provide the relevant information. So if we come back here, that when a person selects a particular city and gets a booking with that conference and gets a list of available flights, we can see that we get some useful information from the WordPress component as we specify. So we've got a paid service or affiliate scheme, or even a way just to promote one's own site, saying what information is being provided by us. And as you see, if we pick a different city, we get a different distribution of WordPress information. So this is how a WordPress web component can be of use and support and provide information for other components in other apps. And it could be not just getting information, but could be using form data sent, because this could be a complete app with a form and selecting relevant information in addition to what is provided programmatically. So we'll now move on to the second demonstration. In our second example, we're going to have a look at a WordPress site that's been made into a set of HTML blocks and rendered on an HTML page at a different location. So if we come in here, the site is listed here. It's also on the site for the talk. And we've seen this one before, where we can change a post literally just by changing the attribute on the web component. But we can also display a whole category of posts, for example, here. And if we were to go into the page source and open up, we will see that what we've actually got is just one component with the particular category ID, and it will display all those categories. Back on the site, what we can also do is have our traditional blog, where we click on a blog item, a blog title, and we get the whole set of the blogs. We also have a login component, because we may want to authenticate users against our WordPress site, even though they're not in our WordPress stack. And if we do that and just type in something here, we will see that we can send that back and get validation and get a particular token back that we can sort of store for future requests. And what we'll also do now is to show the nature of the dynamic importing of web components. Is if we go into the dev tools and into the network, notice how there's nothing here. We can load components on demand, and it can see that it's loading a whole load of different posts and their content on demand. We can also make components have a sort of a lazy load attribute. If you notice this red line here, we can use traditional JavaScript applications and code to, as we'll see here, to basically load in images as they're needed, and including also posts. So these web components, they use standard JavaScript, so therefore we can use all those APIs in the HTML spec in our web components. And lastly, what I've done here is if we go onto this particular page, we can use some of the more advanced HTML5 capacity, such as loading in all our posts into IndexedDB, which is the browser's very own database here. And so that we can make effectively like single page applications where we're loading in all the posts that they're preloaded and they're getting them from this IndexedDB. And what that does mean is if we were to go offline, it will still work because it's loaded in the browser. And here we're loading all the different category posts that we can store in advance. And the way that was done was on the initial home page. In home here, for example, we loaded in all of those posts here using a special web component that loads the IndexedDB with all those different categories. So if I come into the application and clear the site data, we see nothing here. But if we were to now reload the page, we will see that all that data has been loaded into the browser's own database. We can even go further and make this a progressive web app to work fully offline. But this is one way that we can preload information and save. So this has been an example of using all the features of WordPress, but as web components in an index HTML page outside of the PHP stack. Obviously, all of these could be put onto one page to make a single page app and mix and matched. So we can see here that this is a complete app that could be rendered in just one component, one web component, somewhere in any framework or HTML site. And we'll now move on to the next demo. In this final demonstration, we're going to see how we, in a React app, we can put an HTML block and use that similar show post web component that we've seen before. And if we go into the React app, into app.js here, we see that I put two show post IDs here with different values. And if we now come to the site, we can see these two show post components displayed within a React app. Furthermore, if we go and change this first one, shall we say, to number 647, we can see that it'll be rendered on change. And there we have it. And this is the web component changing, not the React app that changes this. So once again, what we've seen is that when we have our HTML blocks, our WordPress blocks, just by changing certain attributes, and remember we can have as many different attributes to customize the component as we like, we can now basically deploy part of our WordPress site in any JavaScript framework. React, Vue, Angular, all these web components are HTML5 APIs and fully browser compliant. So once again, if we return this back to 1220, the original post, and if we save that, we will see that we will now get back that original post. So what we've done is we've seen three demonstrations, one integrating with a whole range of apps by providing services in one separate app. We've seen the WordPress site basically made into a lot of microservices or micro app working in an HTML page, a great variety of, say, complex and highly functional web components. And we've also seen an example how it can be used within a React app itself. So that'll bring the demonstration to a conclusion, and we will now proceed on. So we've seen how the state of the non-WordPress world involved web components between frameworks and working together as an app. And we've seen how that through the use of WordPress web components, not only can we use them within our own site and in Gutenberg block and PHP pages, but we can also now use these web components in other frameworks or with other frameworks in apps in HTML-based applications. So what about business uses? Well, it's no different to any retail product that wherever we can place it or sell it or have people use it for premiums, that we can actually now use the vast amount of content and actual functionality that we can do in processing information coming in and supplying relevant information based on that through increased exposure and sales, through commercial synergy, paid services, or many other possibilities not yet conceived. The core aspect of HTML blocks means that we're no longer separated from the rest of the internet world, but actually are a part of it, as we have seen in other applications, and can extend WordPress beyond its own stack. So it's apps sans frontières. Apps will then be designed by components from different frameworks based on what the component can provide, where they can all be joined together to create a complex app. And what it also means is each of these components is made from little blocks, web components in themselves, like HTML, where we build a whole page of HTML based on HTML tags. Hello, I do hope you enjoyed the talk. I tried to make it business-like as well as not too technical, but also include the relevant technology as appropriate. Remember, we have the website here for the slides and the repos and the free online course. Thank you once again for this talk, and I'll now be available for any questions.
Thank you, Craig. That was fascinating. We have a couple of comments in the chat. Joseph said, the first thing he says is mind blown, which is, I completely agree. He also said, pulling a specific block from a post can be very useful. He said, imagine listing every YouTube video embedded within a WordPress site and then sorting it dynamically by tag or category. The flexibility is almost endless. So that's pretty, we do have one question that just came in. How do the web components communicate with the React and other framework components? How are events in web components handled?
It's a very good question. They can differ. React is slightly different to the other frameworks, but all the events are custom JavaScript events, so all components can listen to them, all frameworks can listen to them. A slight adjustment with React because it has its own different system, but it's the same JavaScript and HTML that these frameworks use. And that's on the links on the site. I have some YouTube videos and information that can help you more.
Yeah, I like that you said, like, just get into it, research it later, but don't try to understand anything at once. It's a lot of info. I mean, one of the questions I had was, you kind of touched on it, is like, this works with any JavaScript framework. Like, it's not a proprietary thing. And is there any limitations? I mean, the first thing I thought is like, oh, does this work in any browser? Like, is the JavaScript supported? But by being in any framework, it depends on that framework. Is that correct?
That's correct, Nico. It's to remember, it is HTML. We never worry about whether we can put an anchor tag or div tag in a framework. These web components are actually just custom HTML. And that's when I don't use the word web component, it's easier to understand. It's just our own HTML. And anywhere there's HTML, it works.
Do you have any idea of what's the browser support for that? I'm assuming older browsers don't support it, but
all modern browsers support it. Older browsers, there's a polyfill. But remember, Google, GitHub, Slack, they all use web components, and they're big players. So it's quite standard. It's about 5 to 10% of the internet.
That's awesome. I have a couple more comments that came in. Somebody said, Mike said, great presentation. Can see components with ACF giving me superpowers. I think that's really interesting. And then Cindy said, I have a much better understanding of web components now. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody else has any questions we're monitoring, but it's, I feel like the main sense of the chat was like mind blown. It's something I've never personally thought of, and it's like, oh, the possibilities of this are endless. So it's
well, it started off with like headless. I mean, when we have headless WordPress, basically we export JSON data and we can display it.
Correct.
What we do now is by combining with the ability to define our own tags and linking the two together, suddenly you can slice and dice your WordPress and put it anywhere you want and run it a bit like a YouTube embed. We can have a YouTube embed, we put it somewhere, it displays it. We don't have to worry. The customer can just change the attributes. They don't have to worry about configuring it. This is what we can do. We can supply people with parts of our WordPress and information to link appropriately. And because it's dynamic, like we saw in the demo app, if you're going to a particular city, the WordPress component will just pick out exactly those things for that city. So
or you could have
on the fly. That's the code, because once we click on that, it sends a signal. The WordPress can listen to it and just render the right information for that particular city.
So I guess you also could have WordPress be your main source of data, and then use the data on your website, on your app, which could be built in other technologies. So that
exactly, and you store it in the browser, everything. I mean, it's just that's why I say web components and REST API 100% internet. There's nowhere on the internet where WordPress, which is a PHP stack, can't go. We're no longer, I feel, limited by that wall, or I felt limited that I couldn't be in that part of the internet. It's just another set of information and functionality we can put anywhere we want.
That's awesome. I have one more. Well, somebody else, Rick, said, thank you very much for your presentation. And Mike said the Udemy coupon doesn't seem to work. So, Mike, we do have a Slack channel.
I'll post
link
all
for
that
that.
in there.
Yeah, you can interact with Craig there. So go to the homepage of the WordCamp Santa Clarita website. There's a link down there to join the Slack, and yeah, we can continue the conversation there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending this session with Craig and myself. Like I said, you can continue a conversation on Slack. Go to the Santa Clarita homepage; it'll be there. And then don't forget to attend our next talk. That's Core Web Vitals and AMP with Tor and Act. That's at 11 a.m. here. Oh, wait, hold on. Before we go, we have one more questions. Sorry. Are there some best practices about developing web components that you could recommend?
Yes, I think on the links on the site, I can detail some more information and lots of sample code. So all on the site. I'll post that up again in the Slack and also in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, and then somebody just asked, where do I go to learn more about web components? I guess.
I've got all that. I'll post it again. Thank you very much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, don't forget to attend our next talk. That's Core Web Vitals and AMP with Tor and Act. That's at 11 a.m. on the same channel. And we'll see you right there after the break.